So to begin, let's introduce ourselves. Would you like to go first?
Of course. So I am Rosanna Falconer. I am co-founder of FashMash and a brand consultant.
And I am Rachel Arthur, other co-founder of FashMash and a sustainability consultant in the main. So very excited to talk about this subject today. We've got loads of people joining us, which is wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Indeed. And we've held several of these since lockdown. As Rosanna rightly pointed out, we haven't done a live for some time for a variety of reasons. So super excited to be back today. But we've had all sorts of different focus over that time. We've talked about things like marketing in a time of crisis. We've talked about the challenge of retail reopenings and what that looks like, which of course we're all slowly but surely starting to experiment with wearing our masks. And sustainability has kept coming up in nearly all of those conversations as a core focus. So we've since gone really deep on this topic. We've had various FashMash Focus events talking around different areas of it in a lot of detail with some incredible members, which has been really, really good. So that's what we're here to explore today, which I can't wait for.
And I want to say some news. We are very proud to now be sponsored by Klaviyo. And that is a FashMash sponsorship across the board. Klaviyo is an e-commerce marketing platform for online brands of all shapes and sizes, from Heist to Skinny Dip London. I'm sure you've heard of them both. We know many of you watching today work in this space, and so thought that this was an invaluable partnership for so many of you. Their focus on growth makes it absolutely invaluable, from powerful insights to precise targeting. If you would like a free trial, please visit, and I'm going to spell it out, klaviyo.com/FashMash, and you'll be able to obtain your free trial there. I'm sure so many of us have been tuning into Digital Fashion Week in various forms, and then also witnessing the handful of real-time shows that have taken place in Paris, from Jacquemus and the wheat fields to the designer Rahul Mishra, who is actually on our most recent Instagram post. He has an amazing sustainable mission with a very social focus, which we'll be talking about later at his course, so do check that out. But for me, the thing that actually most inspired me, it taps into the new accessibility of the industry, and actually it's far more inclusive than the exclusivity of Fashion Week. So I want to focus on that. It is J.W. Anderson's chunky knit colour block cardigan for Harry Styles that went viral on TikTok. And for me, that tapped into a trend that I loved over lockdown, which is the DIY and craft trend. And I'm thrilled. I was thrilled to see that happening. But then J.W. Jonathan took it even further. He released a downloadable, completely free of charge pattern of this cardigan. And just did it in the most gracious way. And that gesture for me, that encompasses this post-pandemic accessibility and inclusivity in the industry. So that thrilled me. And if you haven't listened to his interview with Imran Ahmed, it's the podcast Business of Fashion, do check it out. Rachel, how about you? What's been inspiring you recently?
Yeah, well, first to say, I love that example so much. And I like this idea, we've talked so much about open source in the technology sense of being like quite a sort of standard process, especially in the sort of startup world. It's so nice seeing it happen in design, and especially in fashion, where we're so used to being very, very closed. And yeah, brilliant. Loved it as well. My inspiration is in this month's British Vogue, the Reset issue, which I finally got a copy of this weekend, having looked in so many stores because it was sold out everywhere. So if you haven't seen it, this issue has got 14 special covers, all featuring what they call the Great British Landscape. And they've all been captured by different photographers and artists. And it's a tribute to the fact that, of course, we've all been looking to nature during lockdown, which I think has been really special for everybody. And they're really beautiful. I've got the David Bailey one. You can see it just here. Which I love, and I have other friends who are collecting many of them, and there's something just quite nostalgic as well about sort of feeling an urgency to buy a print copy of something, which just feels really nice. But what I really love in it actually is Edward Enninful's editor letter, and I think it really encapsulates a mood that's happening right now. So I just want to read part of it. He says, "A truth has been exposed by the tumultuous events of 2020. There is no normal to return to. Like many of you who I've spoken to or corresponded with over these past months, I share a sense that actually normal is what got us to this point in the first place. If we are going to evolve to a place of greater fairness and safety for our planet and its people, our future cannot look exactly like our past. We are going to need a genuine rethink about many areas of our lives, our attitudes, our priorities, our compassion, what and how we consume, what we stand for and how we voice it. Hence the focus on a reset, and how perfect a setup for today's conversation as well.
These lives stem from our focus sessions where we have a really intimate conversation with founder members from brands and retailers. And the key top line takeaway that we began the sessions when discussing sustainability was this idea of recovery. Because the industry is inevitably focused on survival right now, which presents a fundamental challenge at the core of this sustainability conundrum. Some stats to begin. Clothing sales halved over lockdown. High street footfall fell by 80%, which is quite phenomenal. And then in luxury, McKinsey recently reported that spring-summer 2020 sales are predicted to be 70% lower than last year. So those are really impactful statistics to begin this conversation. And that's going to impact on the bottom line. And that is obviously the immediate concern in any boardroom. Brands and retailers in the FashMash Focus sessions that I mentioned earlier, they were completely upfront, a lot of them, about the fact that it is being sustainability is being deprioritized by businesses, at least for this period, while the inventory and footfall are the immediate focus. How do we balance this need to sell harder than ever with more conscious consumerism? There's this really uncomfortable contradiction at play for me here, Rachel, particularly as someone who's worked in-house at a brand before, and I know that sales figure is the target.
And it's really hard. I mean, we did definitely hear that from people around deprioritization, especially during this period. But, you know, there were others that were saying that they're recognizing the need that sustainability needs to be put higher up the priority list thereafter, in recognition of actually what's happened and this need to be prepared and become more resilient for future crises ahead. And obviously that being very largely the climate crisis. So a lot of pros and cons happening there, just in the way that the attitudes towards things and the strategies that are being put in place. What we're mainly hearing right now, however, and you know, to your point around needing to hit that bottom line, you know, and get those numbers back up again, is of course this encouragement to return to spending. Hermes is one perfect example. They hit a new record in terms of sales. This has been the example that has been used a lot, but a new record in terms of sales on their reopening day in one of their stores in China. It's something like $2.6 million in a single day. Just completely insane. You know, and that's coupled with the fact that also we're seeing some countries using the crises, and this is sort of explained by the World Economic Forum with some of the campaign work they're doing at the moment around this notion of a great reset. And they say that some countries are using it as an excuse to weaken environmental protections and restrictions that have previously been put in place. And then as a result, you know, that means that we're seeing any environmental gains that have been in place before, and indeed the environmental gains that we saw at the beginning of lockdown being pushed back even further, which is just, you know, is very disappointing and very concerning. And I think, you know, the sort of larger sustainability concerns are rightly in place right now. You know, we have to be really talking about these things. So there's tons for us to explore here. And I think the biggest part of it, you know, as Edward said in his letter, really, is this notion of not returning to business as usual. And can we see this as an opportunity, which I think is, you know, that's what we've been talking about with doing these from the very beginning. I remember that was one of our very earliest parts of the conversation that we had on one of our IG lives. And I think it's more crucial than ever right now. So that's been a really central part for all of our conversations, right? Every single time we've spoken to anybody on any subject, it's been around like, how do we continue this forward without just returning to what normal was, quote unquote, previously. And I think in an ideal world, many of us don't actually want to do that. You know, we all recognize that on an individual level, that there was lots of the sort of system before that wasn't really working. You know, even if that's as simple on a personal level as not wanting to commute every single day into an office. You know, there's all sorts of different variations on that same theme. And I think that that's particularly important when we're obviously looking at the climate. So there's some good statistics around this as well. There was a report done by the Climate Coalition And they found that 72% of people in the UK believe we have a once in a lifetime opportunity right now to tackle climate change and protect the environment. And 75% believe if we, and largely they mean they're the government, don't do so, that opportunity is going to be lost and we will indeed just go back to normal. So it's quite astounding. Those are big numbers. You know, it's saying that we need to really think about it properly right at this point, and this idea of a green recovery is really critical. Now, the difficulty is, of course, that the economy is in a downward spiral. As you rightly said, we need to hit numbers. You know, businesses are in survival mode. And so we're all being encouraged, as we mentioned, to go back out there and shop. And that makes sense for the right now, but it doesn't make sense. It doesn't account for climate change and indeed the arguably bigger crisis that we're talking about ahead, you know, beyond just the pandemic. So I decided to dig into this subject in a lot of depth, as I'm sure lots of people that are listening to here hopefully have already seen. And I ended up writing 2 articles about it, one for Vogue Business called Fashion's Post-Growth Future, and the other for Eco-Age, which is a much deeper dive called Fashion's Existential Crisis, questioning the growth imperative. And indeed, it was doing exactly that, questioning this idea of growth. And we then had a dedicated FashMash Focus discussion on this very topic, where we had some incredible voices really digging in deep with us on what it means to, you know, run a business today and manage those expectations, really around hitting the numbers that you need to hit and also becoming more and more sustainable. So essentially what this was about, the article particularly, and that notion of post-growth, was looking at the fact that while sustainability has become a really key topic in this industry, you know, we're all talking about it constantly. It's sort of, for want of a better phrase, been like the big trend, you know, the big key focus for the last couple of years, and that's only increasing. What we're actually seeing when you look at the numbers is that any solutions that are being put in place are not happening fast enough to counterbalance the harmful impact of rapid growth that we're otherwise seeing. And now that comes from a report from the Global Fashion Agenda, so it is you know, quite qualified. And I'll give you an example because it's quite a hard one to sort of wrap your head around.
Yeah.
And this is why I called the article The Existential Crisis, because it's basically saying that, you know, all the efforts that we're making right now aren't actually achieving anything, that they're just incrementally.
It's so frustrating to hear.
It's really scary,
and I'm sure
actually.
everyone will agree with us. Yeah, Rachel, so frustrating. Do go on.
It really
but
is.
I just need to explain.
Exactly. So, and as I said, hence this notion of an existential crisis, because if you're working in one of these positions where you're trying to make a difference, but actually your company is growing too fast for it to have any real impact, you know, you can see it on a chart, can't you? Growth is going like this, sustainability is going like this, but it always stays just under the growth amount. Doesn't actually overtake it, then you're not making any net reduction. So Kering is a prime example, the luxury group. There was a very good story in the Business of Fashion talking about this previously, and within it, Sarah Kent, the writer, highlighted that while Kering reduced its footprint by 12% in 2018, that's as a proportion of revenue compared to a year earlier. On an absolute basis, that was fully offset by the company's growth. And I really like this phrase. She wrote that means that its progress is thus limited by its success. Yeah. And I just think that's kind of mind blowing. So in other words, they say it basically means that the only option that we have really truly to make a big difference in terms of climate change is to produce less. Like, that's kind of essentially the conclusion of where I get to, that every other effort isn't really getting us anywhere. And it's a no-brainer when you spell it out. Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, for an industry built on consumerism and wanting more and novelty, that is very foreign to hear. Yeah,
exactly. That's the crux of it. It's really tough to hear. But when you say it out loud, you know, it's a bit of a no-brainer when you look at the maths of it. And I really like looking at things from a scientific evidence perspective. Like, that's the only option, and it's really rarely spoken about, as you say, because, you know, we are a consumerism driven industry, as, you know, the majority of consumer goods are, of course. We are about constant growth. We've got to satisfy shareholder returns and expectations, and we feed into a broader economic construct, which is of course all about GDP, which is constantly about grow, more, and that meaning supposedly, you know, an improvement of the human condition, which we'll come on to is certainly not always the case. So just to explain it a little bit more, because I think people might be interested in the context, and then then we'll move to another subject, but this one I'm just particularly obsessed with, as people probably are gathering. But I think what's really interesting here is that it's really important to, like, separate out what we mean about different growth and the sort of different thoughts that are around this space right now. So there's basically two like counter arguments that are in existence. One is called the green growth argument, and this basically believes that we can move fast enough with new technologies, new innovations, new efficiencies, that we can reduce global emissions enough that we can hit the Paris Agreement goals. And those Paris Agreement goals are what's crucial in terms of averting climate catastrophe. So that's one. And then the other side is called degrowth or post-growth movement. And that's basically saying that what we need is a fundamental rethink on levels of consumption and production, because those technologies aren't going to be fast enough, as I explained, to actually get us there. And so that's basically contesting that net reduction cannot occur in terms of reducing impact when business keeps expanding at such pace. So those are the two arguments. And of course, that's really, really hard in fashion. You know, we are a business that is built on volume. You know, that's what we've always been about. It's around, you know, how can we scale as fast as possible? And the industry really is scaling it. You know, obviously we've got a setback right now. Obviously things have really slowed down, and this is not suggesting that that's the right thing to do. It has to be a much more controlled process than what's happened right now. But there is predictions, and I think this is supposed to still stand because they're longer term, but the prediction is for 81% growth on the size of the industry right now as a whole. And that's mind-blowing when you think about the fact that at the moment we produce something like 100 billion items of clothing, depending on what report you look at. It's anywhere from 80 to 150. So that times 80% is just completely nuts in terms of the scale of it. And also that's also meant to mean a further 50% growth in emissions by 2030. So we're meant to be going down in carbon emissions, and with the growth we're seeing, that's predicted to just go up. So we just can't have it. We just literally can't have it this way. And one of the amazing interviews I did, someone called it the ultimate elephant in the room, and it really, really is, because we're just talking about it, and it is, relatively speaking, quite straightforward in theory. Of course, in practice, it's incredibly complex. You know, everything we're seeing right now is that it's so painful what's going on with the way that the industry is being detrimented, obviously society at large as well, jobs being lost, etc. But these are the sorts of discussions that we truly need to be having. You know, what we're fundamentally doing here is questioning capitalism, but maybe now is the right time to do that and to restructure it in a way that really works for everybody. So it's no small task, but it is definitely one we have to really think about. We really have to confront it. Yeah, that's a great word. Yeah. And just to sort of round this out, and then I'm going to throw it to you, Rosanna, because I've just done a massive monologue. But to round it out. On this. Well, I'm certainly one that has managed to learn lots about it by interviewing lots of experts on it. But you know, this is such a complex subject, full stop. And I want to acknowledge the fact that we've got to take the people part of the equation into consideration too. You know, as we're seeing right now, that reduction in output, of course, is leading to job loss, as I just mentioned. And as I said before, this can't happen. This isn't a sort of a suggestion for a strategy that can happen overnight. You know, we can't suddenly go, okay, we're just going to cut the amount we produce, because of the devastating consequences that it will have. And of course, as we've been seeing around the world right now. But the key in all of this, and what so many people kept telling me in my research, which is so fundamental about the fashion industry, is that we are unequal, like full stop. This industry is built basically on cheap, if not slave labor, as we have seen talked about, and as I know you're going to talk about in a second. And that basically means that we've got no choice but to address this, full stop, because the system doesn't work as it stands, and it's not going to work in a continued sense either, because of the increased damage it's going to do. So we need to readdress it. We need to pay a living wage, for instance, and we need to better balance that with also what the Earth can actually handle from a planetary perspective. So tons and tons and tons to unpack there, you know, loads of it to explore. But the key really is around that idea of like transparency, essentially, and how do we make sure that we are aware really of what's happening in our supply chains. You know, there's tons going on here right now currently, as we know. We've seen this hugely during the pandemic. Of course, we've seen it just recently on home soil with Boohoo. Rosanna, I'm going to throw it to you. I've done my monologue, but you know, for me, this is crucial that we are thinking about it, but we've got to bring it back to like, where does that fit in this scale of what the Earth can cope with? Because we don't have much choice but to really tackle this within the next 10 years.
I found that social justice was top of mind. And it has been top of mind in the media for me as well. And I really think that it's gained more prominence over the pandemic, which has actually been really heartening for me. Think of the ramifications of these cancelled orders for the supply chain. It's just monumental. Or take the expose of Boohoo UK in the Sunday Times. I'm sure you all saw that, read that article. If not, Hannah will share a link. But I also encourage you all to read an article that I read in the Financial Times, actually in May 2018. So this is 2 years ago. They did a fantastic long read, Dark Factories, Labour Exploitation in Britain's Garment Factories. And it was appalling, the anecdotes, the stats, the evidence that they brought out 2 years ago of what was going on in Leicester. And of course, if we're talking Leicester hit the headlines for their localized lockdown. They were the first in Britain to have one. And that is the undeniable link is very evident. So this, coupled with Black Lives Matter, brings a new focus to the agenda: intersectional environmentalism. Leah Thomas, who is a thought leader in this space, she wrote a fantastic piece for American Vogue, which really summed up this concept. It is an inclusive version of environmentalism that advocates for both the protection of people and the planet. There has been activism to highlight the environmental impact of fashion, but generally consumers, I find, are still aware, they're still fairly unaware of the social side, even when it's happening on their doorsteps, as in Leicester. And I think, and generally in the UK, I think when people think of the social side of sustainability, they think of Bangladesh. Obviously, there was the Rana Plaza crisis, but the wake-up call that we've all had is that it is far closer to home.
Absolutely, yeah.
And all too often, conversations around sustainability focus on the environmental side of things. I was actually culprit to this when I first started investigating and looking into the sustainable side of my clothes and writing about it. The thing is, it is so much easier. It's so much more tangible talking about the environmental side of sustainability. I also find for brands' marketing teams, they can pull out very promotable results quite quickly. You know, a fabric change, a really nice quick fix, or a switch. It's there's a good PR story. Whereas social, it's harder. Olivia Firth spoke at FashMash Pioneers last year to a sellout audience. And for her, she really underlined that she always puts the social side of things first. For her, if we can look after global citizens, as she calls them, never consumers, that's key. Environmental care will follow. Also from Olivia, I would encourage you all to tune into her podcast with Lucy Siegel. And in the very first episode, it is, isn't it? In the very first episode, they speak to Kalpona Akhtar, Executive Director of the Bangladesh Centre for Worker Solidarity. And she really is at the forefront of the crisis in Bangladesh and the plight of the workers in this part of the world. So that was recorded at the very start of lockdown. Over the period of lockdown, though, I was so heartened to see the possibilities of social media for impactful social change. First of all, the Pay Up campaign, so #PayUp. The campaign was launched by fashion advocacy nonprofit Remake at the end of March. It gives a voice to the most vulnerable. For me, it is the antithesis of the tokenistic visual that's kind of thrown up on Instagram, but it's actually highly effective remuneration for those who need it most. To date, they have recouped an estimated $7.5 billion in unpaid garment worker wages. And so that's since March the 30th. And it's from 16 brands, including H&M and Nike. So seriously impressive stats. I'm going to repeat that, $7.5 billion. Founder Aisha Barenblatt highlighted in an interview with Vogue Business the irony of brands who post performative Black Lives Matter, for example, the Black Square, content. So, and they do that for PR purposes. And I'm seeing others are agreeing, but it's just completely performative when they don't actually stand for racial justice. That might be in the supply chain, that might be in the boardroom. And it's just, it can't continue in this industry. It is really quite appalling. Rachel,
I
were
would
you going to
agree.
tap
And
in?
yeah, just to say, I mean, I literally couldn't agree more. I mean, the one thing I would just emphasize here is that that is an incredible number, but it's still not enough, as
Yeah,
we well know. Like, there are still
yeah,
a lot of brands who have not paid up and absolutely have to. Like, there is, I mean, it's just unbelievable that they think this is okay to just not take the orders that they actually place. And I can't believe there's a loophole in the system that allows that to be the case. So incredible work with this campaign. And I just really hope that it keeps progressing and it does make those other key stakeholders, you know, accountable as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, the pay up campaign, as well as the tangible financial possibilities of it for these people in the supply chain without a voice. And also bear in mind, a great thing about what they do is they actually are almost whistleblowers. A lot of these garment workers have been contacting them via DM, so it works on both sides. For me, it shows the power of social media and influence for good. So take someone like Amber Valletta. She was at the forefront of the Pay Up campaign. I noticed that my sister, Venetia Lamanna, also was, she did a really good Instagram live with them, which was fantastic to see. But then take Aja Barber. If you don't follow her captivating account, you absolutely must. She has just this no-nonsense, impactful, but perfectly worded, and truly it's striking, it hits you, activism. And that saw her go viral last month. And for me, seeing voices like that gain such momentum is fantastic to see. As we have discussed before on these lives, brands have had to be agile in their responses to consumers. You know, consumers, I think, empowered by seeing activists use their voice, they're now doing the same, and they are aware of their voices, they are flexing their voices, they are mobilizing them, and they are making brands act responsibly. It is so exciting to see.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I love the likes of Adja for really doing these companies to account.
Yeah.
And just the sort of no attitude towards it of like, this is not, you know, it's not okay. Yeah, it'd be really powerful. So I think we're on where there's a lot of change coming. And I think the point is these conversations have to go hand in hand, you know. We have to be talking about environmental and social justice together, which of course is what this idea of intersectionalism that Leah Thomas so wonderfully articulated, and indeed there's a dedicated Instagram account for it now, which is very worth following also. But we really, I also think, have to be thinking quite radically about the change that's needed, and we're just not really seeing that in the system we're in right now. You know, we know it's not going to be okay, as we mentioned, to just cut jobs, indeed to continue treating those in the supply chain as badly as we have been doing. But it's also, and also it's important to say, you know, and this is the point of what Leah really talks about as well, is that it is those that are most marginalised that are the ones that are going to be affected by climate change the most. So it's even more important that those two things go hand in hand. That, you know, it's crucial, they have to. You know, it's not going to be us sat in London that is as badly affected by the ramifications of climate change as they come, certainly not as quickly. So yeah, it's not going to be okay to do that, but it's also not going to remain enough to just say that we need to protect jobs in order to justify the scale of damage being caused through that volume scenario that I talked about. So there's a lot of work to do, you know. There's, as I said before, like there's tons to unpack here, but we've got to look at both of those things together and identify actually how can we progress in a way that actually will drive change. And I think ultimately the only thing it comes down to is looking at big business and looking at government and, you know, citizens, as Livia would rightly put it as well. You know, it's those three existing together. And I think final angle really for today, which is another one we've been exploring a lot, and that is indeed around the role of the consumer, or indeed citizens, in all of this. And as we mentioned at the beginning, the pandemic has really placed us in a position to think about this idea of like needs versus desire. You know, we're all sat here, we've all been in lockdown, we haven't needed to buy like really beautiful things to wear out. I think there's a lot of desire for it again, you know, we really want it, but do we need it? You know, and certainly do we need fast fashion in the way that we did before? You know, that's a really big debate currently, and I really hope that is unifying a lot of us, because we're all in this same position, you know, really for the first time in the world, we're all in the same position at the same time, where we can readdress a lot of things when we are fortunate enough to be able to do so. And I think that's really, really important, and I really hope that it does start making a difference. You know, we're seeing the climate crisis being talked about and you know, being talked about publicly, but and the social injustice as well, more than ever, because of everything that's going on. And I think that's a huge positive. You know, it is really in the news, and that's critical. That can only be a good thing. So the question here is, are we at a tipping point, do we think, where citizens can recognize more than ever that they have the power to take some action towards this? And I really hope so. Rosanna, what's your view? I know you have.
I noticed from the hearts you were getting through there that we have a lot of active global citizens listening, clearly, and it's heartening. They clearly feel that there's that the time is now. For me, the key takeaway is education, and that generally seems to be the consensus on the FashMash Focus sessions as well. The queues outside Primark were striking, to say the least, and shocking, to say the most. But the general consensus, I know amongst me and Rachel and amongst those on the calls, was that consumers think they have the right to shop cheaply, but someone in the value chain is... exactly, but someone in the value chain is always at a disadvantage. Consumers must be educated on this in order to stomp out the privilege problem, and that is privilege problem. That is the crux of the matter when it comes to the consumer. There's the marketing from the brands, first of all, and this needs to be, I mean, that's how we're going to educate the consumer. Whether that's traceability and visibility within the clothing itself, just like we might get on our food, or is it through campaigns? Is it highlighting the stories of the garment workers or visually showing how they made the clothing? When will that change come from the brands? We're also, I think, we need to confront the power of influence. I mentioned Amber earlier. I mentioned Aja Barber. Those who is using their influence as a powerful force for change, as opposed to those who back the Black Lives Matter movement one day with a black square, and the following day they are posting a swipe up to fast fashion with an affiliate link. This is appalling and disgusting behavior, and it stinks. Rachel, I feel we need another live to really deep dive into the consumer, but also I want to look at the circular economy and the alternatives for the consumer. Once the education comes, what are their options? We need another session, please.
we do. I know, indeed, because actually today what we've really talked about are the issues and the challenges, and we've not dove into the solutions. And there are beginning solutions. I mean, we said the one around just producing less, but you know, how do you do that? And importantly, as you say, what are some of the other options? And indeed, moving towards more of a service economy, circular economy is you know, quite an exciting way of thinking about it. So I agree. Let's definitely do one on that.